I'm Veronica Hope-Hailey. This is me. I'm from the University of Bath. I've just done 7 years as the Dean of the School of Management there. But I'm now, next slide, Athena, I'm now what they call University Vice President, which means I'm one down from the Vice Chancellor. And I'm in charge of strategic external engagement. Now, I'm just going to say this because that means I sit on the senior team, and I have done for the last 7 years. And what I'm going to talk about today, I don't want anybody to think that I think any of this is easy. We employ 3,500 people at the university. We furloughed 800 staff. Life has been extremely complicated and difficult over these last few months. And so I'm going to talk about my research, but I want everyone to understand that I think being a senior manager at the moment is an extremely difficult place to be, but also in some ways quite an inspiring place to be. So talking about trust and trustworthiness in the workplace is what we're going to do this afternoon. Next slide, please, Athena. I've divided the talk into really a few main sections. First of all, for those of you, just in case you've never thought about trust, well, on what basis am I talking about it? And I'll tell you a little bit about the studies that I've done over the years, and also just some very basic concepts about trust that I think are very relevant for the situation we're in today. And then I'm going to go on and try and give you some practical hints for your organizations and your jobs. And really, you know, the questions I'm posing you, is it that actually it's about building trust at the moment? Is it that you're in an organization where you're having to repair trust, like in Mike Ashley or something like that? Or are you in a situation where you actually enjoy quite good levels of trust and you're just trying to maintain them through this current crisis and beyond? I am in the middle of research, literally at the moment, with board directors on their decision making around COVID. I'm going to share a little bit with you about that. And then I think I'd like to just finish with a few comments on the implications for trustworthiness going forwards in the business arena. So that's the structure of the talk. That's where we're going to go over the next 25 minutes. And we'll get started, Athena, with the next slide then, please. So again, on what basis can I make these assertions, and you know, some of the basic foundations around the idea of trust and trustworthiness? So my current projects, as I say, I'm literally in the middle of data collection at the moment. And looking at trust and trustworthiness through the COVID crisis. I've so far done individual interviews with 50 executive board directors from different companies, plus focus groups with about 25 HR directors. I'm doing this work with the CIPD, and that report will be launched in September 2020. It's a very rapid practitioner report, and I do hope some of you will be able to look at that. Earlier this year, just before COVID, with the Forward Institute, we did a survey of the 22 employers that make up the Forward Institute. And we got just over 3,500 survey responses there. So we know what trust was looking like before we went into this crisis. Actually, Athena, can we go back one? Thank you. And I also published something on trust and purpose and culture with the Financial Conduct Authority. Again, just before COVID. I doubt if anybody read it because it was literally just before lockdown. I think it's a report that probably died on the desk. So I'm very involved in stuff at the moment. Previous projects, you might have heard me speak before, and importantly for this conversation, I did 3 reports on trust and trustworthiness following the financial crisis. And some of what I'm going to draw on today is actually based on that research, but I'm going to try and say what's relevant for COVID at the moment. And actually, I was looking at trust and leading change as early as 2006, before the financial crisis. So this enables me to share with you the next slide, Athena, which actually shows, if you like, these different survey responses over this time period. So you'll see the research that I was doing with the Change Management Consortium before the financial crisis. This is what trust in the public and private sector looked like before the financial crisis. So you'll see the green there is high trust, the brown is average trust, and blue is low trust. And you'll see that the private sector before the financial crisis enjoyed either average or high trust. There was a very, very low score for actually low trust in the private sector, a little bit more for the public sector. But basically, before the financial crisis, you know, things were not too bad. Now, the next bar chart shows you the survey that we did in 2011. And you'll see that, you know, the private sector after the financial crisis was not enjoying such high trust. That had actually declined, and there was a concurrent rise in low trust as well. What is interesting, because business has put a huge amount of investment into trust and trustworthiness in between 2011 and now, is if you look at the Forward Institute results that we collected at the beginning of this year, I mean, actually, the results aren't hugely different. And that's a surprise. And that tells us something about what's actually going wrong, if you like, with some of the trustworthy stuff. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But that gives you a kind of state of play of where we are in the situation at the moment. I think somebody might not be on mute, because I can hear a lot of clattering in the background, and I don't think it's me. So if anybody's not on mute, if you could just go on mute, that would be so helpful. Athena, the next slide, please. And in case anybody thinks, well, why would you trust Veronica? She's just an academic. I mean, that will show you 2019, this is the Ipso Mori results for trust in different professions. And you'll see, unsurprisingly, politicians were very low, advertising executives second to bottom, and business leaders come in just above estate agents. So, you know, not a great situation for business leaders, but my goodness, have they been doing a wondrous job over the last few months in addressing that issue. And I'll go on to talk about that in a moment. Next slide, Athena, please. So why does trust matter in a crisis? Well, a couple of just academic definitions. There's only really two big academic slides here, and this is one of them. And it's really important to just grasp what this means and why it's important now. So a very, very established definition of trust is this one from Denise Rousseau, very eminent US academic. And she says that trust is a psychological state, so it's up here, comprising the intention to accept vulnerability. So it's the idea that somebody will accept risk, will accept making themselves vulnerable, because the person that is asking them to take that risk, they have positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of that other person. So think about what this has meant in COVID. Huge uncertainty amongst people, huge vulnerability felt by, I think, everybody across this world. But actually businesses have been required in some cases to ask people to take risks. Bank frontline workers have been required to go into branches, let alone the health workers that have been working. And so therefore the senior managers and the directors in those organizations, they're hoping that their people trust them. They're hoping that those people are willing to take that risk because they have positive expectations in their senior leaders. So next slide, Athena. And one of the other great difficulties in a crisis is this, if you like, is the character of trust. which makes it very, very different from engagement, because trust comes on foot but leaves on horseback. Not my clever phrase. It's an old Dutch proverb that we found when we were researching in the Netherlands in an earlier project. And what does this mean in a crisis? It means you can't manufacture it. You can't do it fast. You can't go into lockdown, get everybody working from home and just put a few slides or videos out about how you can trust the senior managers of this organization. You go into a crisis either with trust or without it. And the problem is, equally, if you go in with high levels of trust because you've worked at it outside the crisis, the problem is that if you have a breach of trust in a crisis, it leaves on horseback. So it builds up slowly and you can lose it really quickly. Very, very difficult situation in a crisis. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now, having thought about those two concepts, one is that trust is about people being willing to take risk and be vulnerable because they trust the person that's asking them to take that risk. And this idea that actually trust takes time to build but can be lost in an instant. What I'm going to try and share with you today are some very practical examples of how you might do any one of these three things. So the first one is, how do you build trust? Actually, if you're in a new organization or a new situation or even a new team, some businesses I've been talking to, people have been recruited and selected during COVID and they've never met each other. So actually, how do you build trust in a new team that's never met face to face? Secondly, if you're unfortunately in a repair situation, you have actually lost trust and it's left for some decision that you've taken during COVID or before, how do you actually restore or repair trust? And thirdly, how, if you've gone into this crisis with high levels of trust and you know that you've had to take difficult decisions and you can see there are difficult decisions ahead of you, how do you maintain that trust? How do you keep trust amongst your various stakeholder groups, within your workforce, with your customers, etc., etc. So those are the three things we're going to just talk about now. So next slide, please, Athena. So building trust. What do we know about how you build trust within a team or within an organization? And here, next slide, Athena, we have 4 basic drivers of trustworthiness. This work was done by 2 sets of academics, Mayer and then Dietz and Den Hartog. The first driver is ability and competence, been very important during COVID. It's not simply about whether you've got empathy, it's about, do I believe my local manager, my HR director, my CEO has the ability and competence to manage this organization in good times and bad, in crisis or whatever. So it's a hard concept there. Ability and competence. Do I think these people know what they're doing? Huge questions over the government and the health officials during this crisis. Do they know? Do I trust them? Do I know what they're saying? Do I believe these people are able and competent? Second concept is benevolence. Do I think these people are self-serving? Are they just bothered about themselves? Or actually, do I see them as being concerned about others beyond their immediate arena? Are they concerned about communities? Are they concerned about society? Are they concerned about my health and my well-being and my family's well-being? Thirdly, integrity. What's the set of values or moral code, or a phrase that's used a lot in the board directors that I'm interviewing? What's the moral compass guiding senior leaders' decisions, medical officials' decisions, Public Health England's decisions? What's the integrity here? And fourthly, very importantly, but very, very difficult in this current crisis, is predictability and reliability. And that's the idea of a person saying, well, can I see this organisation or this person displaying ability, benevolence and integrity on a reliable, predictable basis. So it's not enough to just come on a blooming podcast and say, trust me. Actually, people make their mind up over a series of predictable behaviours. So those are the 4 things that will build trust. But hopefully most of your organisations went into this crisis with high levels of trust, but God forbid that you should end up in a VW situation, for instance, with the US emissions, where they actually were a highly trusted company, but through a series of decisions they made, they actually breached the trust of customers and indeed the US population and beyond. So let's have a think about what happens if you're in a trust repair situation. And Athena, we can go on to the next slide. So if you find yourself in a trust repair situation, maybe you have made a bad decision during COVID. Maybe you with your team made a bad call, and you know, we all make mistakes. What do you do there to repair trust? Well, immediately, the very first thing you must do, whether you're a CEO or a team leader, is if you've made a mistake, you must apologize and take responsibility. Now, the lawyers will very often tell a CEO to never apologize. But depending on the severity of the situation, all the research shows that apology is necessary. And secondly, taking responsibility. This is not a time for a CEO to say, oh, it happened in America. It wasn't, you know, I was in England. I wasn't aware of this. You've got to take responsibility if you're the senior person responsible for this. Secondly, you immediately express regret for others. And that's that benevolence piece. I am sorry for any harm or injury I may have caused, or any misunderstanding, or any environmental disaster or health disaster. So express regret for others. Thirdly, order an immediate and independent investigation. And you'll see that Boris has already called for a review on how COVID has been managed in the UK. Without waiting for the review, if you know that some people are culpable and have been involved in this breach of trust, then if you can, you exit them, particularly people at a senior level, because they are tainted by that scandal. And then fifthly, you work tirelessly to demonstrate trustworthiness. You turn the volume up on ability, benevolence, integrity, and predictability. In the medium term, and we will see this with the government, they will publish the results of that investigation and they will face Q&A. But if you're within a business, what you then have to do is decide on the basis of that investigation whether this is a blip. Everybody makes an error, everybody makes mistakes. Is this actually an error, a wrong decision that was made, or does it suggest there is a bigger problem, perhaps a systemic problem, a cultural problem? This is what the banks were accused of after the financial crisis. There's a systemic cultural problem. Fix the bigger problem. And if that is the case, then you're into some kind of transformational change. And you're into overhauling selection, promotion, reward, career development systems, which you all know extremely well. So that's what's happening if you're in a repair situation. But let's hope nobody is in that situation yet as a result of COVID. So if you've gone into the crisis with high trust, you're not in a repair situation, then what you've got to do is continue to maintain trust. And this is what we found out from previous research. Athena, the next slide. And what you're really trying to do when you're maintaining trust is creating a bridge from pre-COVID into post-COVID situation. You're trying to get people across a bridge from one reality to another, maintaining their trust as you do it. So we go into Athena, the next slides. So 3 practices here. First of all, just as I've just been saying, it's all about building bridges to the future. And what is really key and has come through from the CEO interviews I've been doing. You build these bridges by actually showing how you are continuing with your core values and purpose. And how, okay, COVID is a crisis, it has destabilized the world, but the way that you're dealing with it is still in line with your core values and purpose that you had before you went into COVID. So this is what we learned from the previous research. Now, there is one exception to this when I get to the COVID research, which I think rocks this a little bit, and I'll come back to that. So what you're trying to get people to move from is this feeling of the future's uncertain, I'm unpredictable, I'm feeling quite scared, into, okay, I understand as much as I can about what's going on and how we are navigating the change and how HR or the senior leaders are trying to protect our organisation for the future. So lots of stuff around communication, and if I had £100 for every time I ask a senior manager about communication and he tells me about downward communication, I probably would have my own Caribbean island. What we are talking about with the communication is two-way communication. Of course, it's the senior team explaining what they're doing, but it's also about listening. It's about the senior team being transparent and honest in what they're talking about, what they can deal with and what they can't, what's good, what's bad. But it is also a listening exercise. Senior leaders being accessible, visible and active in delivering communications. And as I've said, drawing on the existing foundations of trust that existed before the crisis. Pointing to the values, the purpose, any symbols that mean something in an organisation, getting those out front to show there is some stability in how they're dealing with this situation. Next slide, please. Practice 2, it's all about emotional and practical support. So you're trying to move people from, I'm feeling really overwhelmed and worrying I'm going to lose my job, to, okay, I can see my employee cares, is supporting me, and will do everything they can to protect my job. But if you're being open and honest, the employers may well be saying, we don't know how much we can protect jobs. And you can read as well as I can there the support actions that managers and senior managers should be taking in. And I've seen a lot of evidence of this throughout COVID. I actually think that through COVID, the majority of the organisations I've talked to have actually been doing this pretty well, particularly HR along the bottom, protecting jobs as much as possible through cost cutting, pay cuts, reduced hours, skill development for redeployment people. It's a good picture so far. Third practice, Athena, is this importance of empowering employees and treating them fairly. And you're empowering them so that they feel some control over their destiny. And you're trying to make them see that you are behaving as fairly as possible in the way that, for instance, you take financial pain. You know, senior managers taking cuts or everybody taking a 20% pay cut, etc., etc. It's the fairness of the situation. And this again is involving explaining the basis of your justice and fairness, being very clear that your HR procedures and processes are fair and transparent, and most importantly, recognizing employee efforts. The lower down the person, the more frontline they are, massive thank and acknowledgement. And again, I've seen that a lot in COVID. So that's what we've learned from the previous crises about how to maintain trustworthiness. But what challenges do I think COVID brings? And yes, Athena, the next slide. These are the organisations where I'm interviewing their board level directors and their HR directors about how they've been trying to maintain trust and trustworthiness through COVID. And I know we were due to have somebody from Nationwide on this call this afternoon, so I don't know whether you're there, but a great series of interviews with your senior team. So it's a range of organisations, mostly business. And I'm absolutely in the midst of this. So I can't give you the final results. They will come out in the report in September. But let me tell you some of the things I've seen that are going well and some of the challenges that I think lie ahead for trust and trustworthiness as we come out of the immediate crisis and into this next stage of restart. So Athena, can we have the next slide? So I'm going to start actually at the bottom. I'm going to start with the triumphs. I think societal issues have been literally thrust into senior level decision making in a way that I have not seen before. So I have heard CEOs battling with big social economic issues and talking about them and their role in those social and economic issues in a way that I've never had conversations with CEOs like that before. And I say thrust into senior level decision making because I would argue that corporate social responsibility was inside out. It was businesses deciding who they would help with in society, how they would help with in society. The difference about COVID is that society has come in to the business. The issues around health and well-being and safety and economic survival have absolutely come in, burst, pushed the door down and got into this boardroom decision making. So some were prepared for this and were ready and were able to respond extremely impressively, some less so. Other triumphs I've seen through necessity, enormous empowerment and distributed leadership. The senior team saying to me, we had no choice. We had to discontinue command and control. We had to empower people because the speed of decision making and the speed of change that was necessary meant that we actually learnt to trust downwards and to trust the lower levels and middle levels of management to manage the situation on the ground locally and make the decisions that they felt were necessary. And we've been talking about that for decades, and it's actually happened in COVID. The third thing I've seen is people have talked about this enormous humanity of leadership, the humanity of seeing the CEO in their home place, the empathy that senior leaders have revealed within their leadership behavior and styles, and the humanity of HR. Somebody said, COVID has put the human back into human resources. Correspondingly, we've seen the elevation of HR. One CEO said to me, cometh the time, cometh the man. Forgive the gender thing, but that's what he said. In other words, this is HR's time. And without them, we would not have been able to deal with this crisis. And I've also seen some really surprising, not the usual suspects, surprising organizations leading on social change. And that will be in the report. It's not the usual giants that have been doing amazing things in this crisis. There's some really impressive smaller organizations doing quite radical things. The challenges: crisis management, swift decisions, complex, uncertain contexts. Senior managers have admitted in points they've made mistakes. It was a fast-moving situation. Often they've been sort of sitting around the television looking at the 5 o'clock briefing, trying to understand what was going to happen next. But a big one, and I put this in bold, is you can pretend we were all in this together. We haven't been. We have not been in this crisis together. It has been absolutely different and varied within organizations. So professional people, the more senior you are, very often you've been sitting working from home. But frontline people have been pharmacy assistants, pharmacy counter assistants. The pharmacies weren't allowed to close. And the pharmacist's behind a counter, but the pharmacy assistant is not. The frontline bank branch person who went in to keep the branches open, the frontline health workers, the security guards that we had to keep walking around our university campus. It has been not a unified experience. And what it has also done simultaneously is rip an elastoplast off our pretense that there aren't social inequalities. There are huge social inequalities. And then the Black Lives Matter movement came, and many CEOs said they simply didn't know how to respond. But in responding to Black Lives Matter, they know that they will never, ever treat equality and diversity again in the same way in their organisations. So those are going to be ongoing things for the next few years that we will have to battle with. Multiple stakeholder management sounds great, doesn't it? Oh, we're no longer in shareholder management. No, we're now stakeholder management, with senior leaders having to make very difficult trade-offs. So who do you back? Who do you help? Do you help your supply chain and stop a small business going out of business? Do you help your employees? Do you help your community? Do you try and pay a dividend to your shareholders? There was a wonderful example from one business which went, oh, we've been entirely employee-centric. Nobody's lost their job. What we've done is take a whole load of contracts in-house, and in actual fact, what's happened is that we've put some small businesses out of business. By actually retaining jobs inside, we've actually put businesses out of business outside. Mental health and well-being obviously is a huge concern, and is going to continue to be a concern for the foreseeable future. And of course, the worst in some cases is yet to come. The tech companies are doing really well. Other companies are doing really well. If you're at all involved with the elderly, you're doing really, really well. But for many, actually, we're going into this next stage of restructuring and possible redundancies, people coming off furlough or not coming off furlough and going straight into redundancy. So there are some real challenges for trustworthiness. And my last slide now, Athena, is therefore this, is the challenges in how we go forwards into this next stage is how do we show our ability and competence in managing a new world order, a new way of working, but also potentially economic restructuring, and how do we show that business is concerned about economic development beyond organisational boundaries into the communities in which it's worked. Benevolence, I think we've shown well, but how do we keep that going where potentially we may be putting some people out of work, and how are we going to explain that benevolence going forwards? The integrity of our decision making, that moral compass that these board directors have talked about during COVID, how can we keep that centre stage and show that that's centre stage as we go into a more difficult period? And lastly, predictability and reliability has been very, very difficult during COVID because it's been so fast moving. But actually, how do we keep saying, look, we're still on track with core values and purpose going forwards? And I'll leave it there, Mike, and open it up for discussion. So I hope there's some things for people to think about there. Thank you.
Yeah. Brilliant. Lots of issues raised there. I was going to ask Simon Keller to give a few words, and also Andy Moat, but I'll give them a little bit of thinking time. And I've got a question for you there. And you always try and bring things down to the very practical and things that people can do something with. So what kind of behaviours would you encourage senior people, senior managers to display in their organisations? And what kind of behaviours are anathema? So what's good and what shouldn't people do? For example, you mentioned things like involvement there. Obviously, that's something that you would hope that organisations were adopting at the present time. Visibility, I suppose. But what are some of the others that you might want to encourage senior managers to get involved with?
Okay, so I think one of the things I talk about there, Mike, is some of the ways that CEOs have responded, for instance, to Black Lives Matter. Some of the good things I've seen and some of the bad things I've seen. So the good things that I've seen, Mike, and I think that was so unexpected for many CEOs. It was so unexpected, and the way that they responded therefore was, in a way, it took them by surprise. So you saw their real behaviour. So the ones that I think handled it well were ones that said, they didn't say, oh, I completely understand how you feel, or I completely understand where you're coming from. Is that actually they didn't say that. They said, if they were white and male, they said, I can't understand where you're coming from, but I am going to listen to what you're saying. So I think it's about not making assumptions what's going on for other people. That's one thing. I think this whole thing of we're all in this together is no longer going to wash, because it's pretty obvious we're not all in this together. And even if you're working from home, if you're a young person, 25, working from home in London, that has meant very often balancing your laptop on your bed, in your room, for 8 hours a day, and it's not been pleasant. And actually having a CEO in a palatial room in his manor house saying, we're all in this together, because we're all working from home, is not being sensitive to other people's experiences. So I think it's about not assuming what people's experience have been like, and not assuming that you know the answers to the solutions. This is one of the times when senior people going forwards have to listen, but they still have to guide and show they can lead and be able and competent. It's just, it's about listening to others about what their experience and their needs are going forwards.
I think the listening word is very important, and I think it's one that we hear a lot, but the practice is, as you pointed out, the practice is very different from the rhetoric. Simon, as a senior psychologist, I guess you're well versed in dealing with these kind of issues, these areas. Can you give us a few words on what Veronica said, plus maybe some of your own thoughts and ideas in this area?
Yeah, well, Veronica, thank you very much. I thought it was fascinating, and I think I sort of pretty much support everything you were saying. I mean, in the past, I've used an equation, trust equals intimacy times credibility over risk, which I think is very similar to what you were talking about. I think as I was listening to you, and we've done some sort of sessions with CEOs and CHROs, I think how you build trust and what you need to do as a leader, I think you've sort of ticked every box there. And it feels like we're in crisis management mode. And I think the leaders very much did the right thing. And I concur with that. But now that we're moving out of that and we're bringing people back, what I'm hearing is that actually the senior leadership want people back into the workplace. And there is some reticence about coming back into the workplace. And when you dig below the surface of what that's about, is actually, I think there is some level of lack of trust the other way. We need to see our people. We need to have our people back. And if I see them, then I can trust them. And so, today you've talked about how we get trust of our senior leaders, but how do our senior leaders build trust of their people?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, what I would say, Simon, is they've learned to trust them. That was this point about empowerment. They've had to trust downwards, because they couldn't micromanage, and they couldn't do this command and control, because decision making had to be pushed down to the local level, and they had to trust. So I think that's a good way forward. And a number of them have said, actually, we realise we can trust. We've got some really able people. I think the second thing I would say about learning to trust downwards is to actually, I'm going to stop monitoring, but we've also got measurements that show that productivity wasn't affected by people working from home, those that could carry on working from home and were not furloughed. And I think we've got to not be afraid to get that data out. A number of businesses have actually said to me the productivity went up with people working from home. EDF, building Hinkley Point Power Station, yes, with all the health and safety measures they had to put in place in EDF, they actually met one of those project goals, and it's the hugest infrastructure project in Europe. They met one of their project goals ahead of time during COVID. And what it was that actually they were really, really careful about people moving around the workplace. And so actually, they've learned that there is a different way of working. And if you can actually show that the way that we've been working has increased or at least maintained productivity, that's good data for senior managers.
Actually got a question from Louise Harrison in the chat. She asks, this is all fascinating but internally focused. How about trust building with customers?
Yeah, well, I've been asking the board directors about that. I've asked them about how they have dealt with their all their stakeholders, supply chains and customers. And again, we've seen some great examples. I mean, an example of building trust with customers was the way that the banks took the decision to open the branches. That was primarily to ensure that those who only dealt with cash could still access a local branch. Now, I'm not stereotyping here, but majority of people that are still working with cash rather than just cards are the elderly. And that's a wonderful example. Santander gave me the example, they did 10,000 customer calls. And they did 10,000 customer calls, mainly targeting their elderly customers, just to check in, were they okay? Was everything operating? Could they actually get the banking services that they needed? I think you've seen with the big infrastructure or big multinationals, a lot of negotiation, for instance, with customers over payments. So if it's business to business, people being very prepared to delay payments from customers for services, if it's business to business, to give them more leeway. And similarly, the other way around in supply chains. So people trying to look after those small to medium-sized businesses very often in their supply chains. So a lot of negotiation around how can we all get through this together.
So I've managed to unmute myself now, which is encouraging. But I was very interested, Andy Moat from B&Q. I mean, you've done lots of work in this area. B&Q has got a good reputation for a lot of the elements that Veronica was talking about. Could you maybe make a few comments and maybe pick up on the last one as well about external customers?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Veronica. I think it was really interesting what you shared there, and a lot of it resonated for me. So just jotted a few things down. I think your point around trust is slow to build and fast to lose is completely accurate. I mean, I think what we saw, and I'm sure I speak for all of us, in the first 48 hours of this crisis, I remember vividly a board teams call where our CEO was sat with his head in his hands, as we all were, thinking, what do we do next? This is we were all, there was no playbook for this, was there? So, but gradually since then, I think we've built steadily through this, and you can see the trust that I think we started from a reasonable base, probably like a lot of organisations, but definitely we are at probably the best connection between the board and our frontline colleagues we've ever had as we built trust through this crisis. And I think a few things have enabled us to do that. So partly some of the values we try and role model, we've got a long way to go on that, but we have humility as an important value at B&Q. And I think that colleagues increasingly were able to see that the board is only motivated by trying to do the right thing for B&Q. And I think I've seen, this is my personal view, but boards in the past who weren't always motivated in that way, and I'm sure that applies to other businesses as well. So if colleagues can see that genuinely in its leadership team, they're motivated to try and do the right thing. Doesn't mean they'll always get it right, but I think they see that in our board team now. We have curiosity as one of our values. I think that's key. I think you talked about that. I think we've demonstrated progressively over time an ability to listen to the business and then respond in a way that they could connect those two things to actions we're taking in response to what they've been asking us for or telling us. And we've dialed up, I think I've talked on here before, the number of different channels we've opened up that we hadn't had before to talk to colleagues. We had our group CEO on with we've issued all of our people form reps for the first time ever. They've all got iPads now, so last week we held a digital on Teams with the group CEO down to kind of customer advisors in stores. So that's working really well for us, and over communicating again, I think has helped to build trust. I think stability is really important in leadership teams as well. I know that you can't create that overnight, but when colleagues can get to know their leaders personally, see them in their stores, in their shops, and around their business, rather than it's just a figure in the boardroom who come and go every 2 years. They deliver a little bit of their personal agenda and move on. I know that's not a quick fix, but the best businesses I've seen have been able to achieve that. And then I think Veronica talked about empowerment of our unit managers have been critical to this. We've essentially empowered them to lead this locally, because it's the only way you could manage it when we were furloughing over half the teams and bringing them back in again. They knew those colleagues and they knew the best way. We just gave them the tools and trusted them to do it. So they've done that brilliantly. So we did have one blip, just to illustrate the point. We made a decision through this at one point to extend our opening hours a little bit, and we didn't give our managers enough notice of that. And it was difficult for them because, for example, they'd had conversation with team members. You can come back to work. You won't have to be serving customers. You can be managing stock. You could be answering the phones. And when we extended the opening hours, some of that they weren't able to fulfill some of those pledges. And we heard about that very quickly and very loudly. And I think our operations director handled it brilliantly. So the next big call we had, he just hands up. I've made a mistake there. Didn't communicate that quickly enough to you. We're going to fix it. And every single time subsequently, we were very conscious. We didn't insist everybody had to switch to a change at the same time. They did it when they were ready to do it. So what we set out was, here's what we want to move towards. You tell us when you're ready to get there, and you can get there in your own pace. And that was a big example. We knew we could have lost trust quite quickly there, because up until that point, we've made a series of good decisions. That was interesting. I think what teams are looking for now, what I hear, is fundamentally security. I think it's a scary time at the moment, isn't it, for lots of colleagues? So they want to know that their business is being well run, good decisions are being made on their behalf, that they can trust they'll have a job still. And then second thing for us is the things we would have been getting into anyway, but I think been accelerated, and it's not an obvious one, but I think somehow it seems to unlocked, and maybe it's because it is a global problem, this wanting to be part of a progressive culture. B&Q has quite a lot of work to do on being more inclusive, but we're working quite strongly now and quickly in diversity, inclusion, and around wellness as well. So today, just by coincidence, we just launched our first ever e-learning module on mental health, and that's the response that's getting from colleagues today. I think you talked about in your slides, people are under a lot of stress at the moment. So that's massively helpful, and it's just great that we've been able to do this at this point in time. I think these things are landing better than they ever would have done in the past, because it's so meaningful now. So those points, and just as a proof point for you, again, just by luck, we did an annual kind of global engagement survey. Closed last Wednesday. We've just recorded our highest ever levels of engagement at B&Q. So we're really proud of that. And it's a sustainable move. No, it's not gone.
That's amazing.
But yeah. And we've split it. Actually, had a quick look at it between colleagues who were furloughed, and at the height of the crisis, over 11,000 colleagues were furloughed and 11,000 were working. Actually, the engagement levels were almost exactly the same between both populations, which is incredible. We did work hard. We didn't always get it perfect, but to keep it highly engaged with the colleagues who weren't working throughout. So I think we've been one of the lucky organisations in terms of the sector we work in, essential retail structure. But I think we've made our own luck to an extent in terms of the leadership team have done, and all colleagues have done obviously as well. So it's we're still learning as we go, but I think there's it's an amazing moment and opportunity despite the huge challenges that are around us as well. Talk about move forwards all the agenda points you've talked about, and that's a big leaders. I think leaders can really step up now and demonstrate their value to the organisation to lead well.
I mean, a lot of the senior people I've talked to, not all, but a lot of them have said there have been such good things that have come out of this that they just simply don't want to go back to how things were. And they've talked about, for instance, how this, our Zoom world is actually much more inclusive and less hierarchical, actually simply because of the way we all appear on screens. So a CEO gets the same size of box as anybody else in these Zoom calls. It's been really interesting. And when I've written it all up, I hope all of you will get access to it. But there's been some really inspiring stuff, absolutely.
Just a couple of comments on the chat line here. There's one from David Wilson. David, I hope you don't mind mentioning your name, but he says, in the early weeks, he was getting regular emails from Tesco and Sainsbury's about the fast-moving changes they were making. And he said he was very impressed by their tone and the actions they were taking to try their best to do the right thing. And I think that's a really interesting observation. And before you comment on that, there's another anonymous comment from someone here. Can Veronica provide some more detail on organisations that have been doing some amazing stuff? Well, we've just had a couple of examples of that. And can she share some examples? What wowed her? You could say Andy's stuff from B&Q is as good as it gets. the Tesco stuff and Sainsbury's stuff, informing people, is pretty good behaviour. But have you seen anything else that you would say that that's really encouraging?
Okay, well, I'm going to show you some stuff that I found very courageous. And it's not going to come, Mike, from where you want it or expect it to. But I was virtually in tears in a focus group listening to the Salvation Army HR director talk about how they try to keep that organisation and those hostels going, with frontline workers in the hostels dealing with homeless or the care homes. You know, some of the bravery stuff and has been from unusual situations. I've actually found some of the reactions to Black Lives Matter being really quite inspiring. I'm going to surprise everybody. When I interviewed the chief operating officer from Foxtons, you know, it's a PLC, estate agents, obviously in London. The amount of stuff that they had going on equality and diversity before COVID and had got going for 2 years previously, that then galvanized into work during COVID, surprised me. I said to them, I don't know anything about this, and you're not doing yourselves enough PR justice. They have 40% of the workforce in Foxtons is non-white. And they have networks for women, networks for Afro-Caribbean, networks for gay communities. And what they have in place in terms of equality and diversity was extraordinary. And that was surprising and quite inspiring. I will say I was surprised and inspired by the work of Day Lewis Pharmacy. Day Lewis Pharmacy is a family-owned business owned by the Patels. I hadn't really taken in, Mike, that the pharmacies, unlike the GPs that could go home and work from home, that all those pharmacies, if you think about it, had to keep open. And if they didn't keep open, they'd lose their NHS contracts. And the way that the Patel family supported 2,500 of their workforce across the country, getting them protective equipment very, very quickly, supporting them to feel safe. And if you think about the average pharmacy, and we're not talking about huge boots, we're talking about small high street pharmacies, how they had to actually protect them, they were pretty inspiring. I think Nationwide's was equally extremely good. And I was also, John Whelan's on the call. I know he's retired now, but John, I was lucky enough to interview the finance director from BAE Systems. And again, BAE Systems, you know, brought a certain proportion of the workforce back. But the way that BAE talked about how they were trying to look after every single group of stakeholders, whether it was customers, suppliers, the government, the way they were dealing with the government and not taking furlough payment because they are in receipt of government contracts. That was really impressive. And then there's just been a few CEOs which, without asking their permission, I don't feel I can name them, but I will tell you the ones that have impressed me are the ones that have said, oh crumbs, I didn't know what to do. But, you know, this is how I try to get my head around what should happen. And I think, you know, I've said this to you before, Mike, in the wake of the financial crisis, a lot of senior leaders in this country were lambasted and were made to look as though they were untrustworthy, immoral, etc., etc. And I always felt that a lot of the stuff that came out after the financial crisis didn't really do justice to the difficult decisions senior leaders have to make about trade-offs between different groups. And I've personally never interviewed a senior leader who I do not find trying to do their very best in difficult situations. And this research And this period of COVID, to be honest, seems to have brought out the very best in people. And it's going to be my great pleasure to showcase that to people. Now, it's going to be difficult to keep it going, Mike, over the next few months. I'm not naive, but I actually believe business has shown some of its best qualities over these months. What everyone has said is, can we keep this up? Can we keep this level of empathy up? And can we keep this style of leadership up going forwards? Can we not revert? Can we keep empowering people? Can we trust downwards? Can we help our communities? Will shareholders be prepared to be less demanding and see us look after other stakeholders? So that's their big challenge going forwards.
Right.
Bit of the State of the Nation speech there,
No,
Mike, sorry.
That's very, very, very good. And, you know, sadly, time's up. I rather suspect we could have gone on for somewhat longer. But, you know, what we try and do here is get people who've got something to say and who say it well. And so I think you've done both of those things brilliantly and with passion and conviction. So that was a brilliant session. Really enjoyed that. Carmen will be writing up the notes and we will send those out to you very quickly, together with a recording, plus also copies of Victoria's slides. She is available for further consultations.
Veronica.
Further, I've only known you for 27 years. I know. We'll be available for further discussions and we'll send you her details so you can get in touch with her if you wish. Veronica, thanks ever so much for your session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope it's been useful for people. Bye-bye.
Thank you.